Welcome to the 5 nonprofit business models revealed. Today, we are starting a program that has a longer term framework, which is really special. It has been co-created with many of you who helped us identify what were the thoughts and concepts that we wanted to bring to this conversation to understand nonprofit business models. We will be together for a period of time. In addition, there is a website that has been built and added to the Commons, which many of you are familiar with. I encourage you to visit Financial Commons to see it in action. And today you will see how our materials will come to life there after today. We will be circulating the materials, so please know that these slides will be coming to you after the session, as well as a recording for anyone who would like to share it with colleagues who were not able to join us today. I also want to thank Blackbaud, who is a very well-recognized leading cloud software. Blackbaud is dedicated to serving the nonprofit sector, from nonprofits to educational institutions, local governments. And in any case, whether you are, and today is an interesting perspective, right? In whatever type of business model you have, the Blackbaud products are there to support you. We will be sharing contact information and links to their website as part of the follow-up materials. And again, really want to thank Blackbaud for allowing this program to be possible today. I'm Hilda Polanco. I'm the managing partner of BDO FMA, and I've been part of the development of the nonprofit Financial Commons for some time and really excited to see these programs come to life. I'll be your co-presenter today. I'd like to introduce Ruth McCambridge, who is our Director of Content and will be with us for the remaining of the program. And we also have Doug. Now, Doug is not here in person. Unfortunately, his schedule could not allow it, but we have a special technology treat where we will have Doug join us during the program with an interesting perspective about the nonprofit sector. So that's who's with us today. And in terms of where the presence is from the sector, I would love for you to tell us, who are you? What is your organization's specific dimension? So the first question is, what is your annual operating budget? And the second question is the organization's mission area. Now, there are 10 options that you have to choose from. If one of those 10 do not feel like it really represents who you are, we have enabled, Elizabeth has enabled the chat box for us, and you can type in your particular mission area. We have given 10 options, and you have one more if you need it in the chat. So go ahead and complete these two polls. It will give us a sense as to who's joining us today, will help us, and will help you sort of understand who the colleagues are that are with us. Elizabeth, I will ask you to publish the results of the poll when you feel like we have critical mass.
Awesome. We have about 60, we're almost at 70% participation, so we'll give it another few seconds to get it up a little higher.
Great, thank you.
Okay, it looks like we're slowing down, so I'm going to end the poll and launch it.
Thank you. Okay, so we have an interesting bell curve almost, with about 22% of the organizations being under 250, 24% being over 5 million, and then distribution in between. Thank you. Thank you so much. And from this point forward, I'd like for you to be thinking about where is the concentration of those millions across the different funding sources that we will be speaking of. To introduce you to each other, take a look at the percentages across from animals and environment all the way through down to self-help. You can see, again, really beautiful distribution of the sector and probably of the various business models, because we'll learn that what we do in terms of our mission often dictates the sources that are available to us. So thank you for sharing that with us. Elizabeth, I'm going to close the poll. And I'd like to continue now to today's content. Again, today we're going to give you an overview of the 5 particular mission or particular revenue-focused models. But this is only the beginning. There will be a series of webinars to follow when concentrating on each of those nonprofit business models. So think of this as an introductory course, and we will have the opportunity in future sessions to dig into some of these areas. We are going to start with Ruth and Doug giving us perspective on the nonprofit difference in financial terms. How are nonprofits different from for-profits, and what do they represent in the sector? We'll then look into the 5 models, primarily revenue-driven models, and what are some model considerations? What are some implications by each of these sources of funding? We have some time set aside for Q&A, and so please, as a question comes up for you, the Q&A button in Zoom is available to you. So please enter your question there. We'd like it to be fresh on your mind. Do not wait for the facilitated conversation. Just share it with us and we'll be on the lookout for those questions and we'll work them into the Q&A time towards the end. Plus you'll have an opportunity to add questions then. Another special part of this program is the resources, and the team at the Nonprofit Financial Commons have been creating a special resource section within the Commons. Please register for the Nonprofit Financial Commons if you haven't already. You can go straight to the location on the website and you will see that today's program is being featured. There are some special tools that will be revealed as part of the program today. And so looking forward to having you join us as part of the function of the Commons and ongoing moderated conversations. At this time, I would love for Ruth to give us some perspective around these differences that the nonprofit sector represents. Ruth?
Great. Okay, I'm sharing this little section with Douglas Rushkoff, who I hope you'll be as fascinated with some of his ideas as I am. But what I'm going to do right now is just talk about the essential difference of nonprofit organizations compared to for-profit organizations. And to do that, this is really kind of a basic, quick run through of how those differences show up, and is really kind of the foundation for all of these business models, which are more the kind of vertical ways that we experience our work. But so what I would like to do is suggest to you that when I run through something quickly, or later on in the session we go through something that you feel like you'd like to hear more about later, if you just also in the question and answer period say, I'd like to learn more about such and such, we will pick it up later in another seminar. Or we will put a resource in the resource section. So please feel like you can be very, very active in the question and answer session, but just say whether it's a short term, I want to ask this question in this session, or I'd like to learn more about this, which tells us that it's, sometime during the series. Okay, so the most essential difference between nonprofits and for-profits is the difference between where profits go, because we're not exactly nonprofit. Lots of nonprofits earn surpluses, although sometimes it doesn't feel like that's a reality, but lots of nonprofits do earn surpluses. The difference really exists in this something that's called the non-distribution restraint, which is where those profits are to go is different between for-profits and nonprofits. Nonprofits are very much like government in this area, in that the net profits are not supposed to go to any individual. No one is considered to be an owner or to have any kind of unfair call on the assets of the organization. The assets of the organization are really supposed to go two places. And the first is kind of to the primary beneficiaries or the mission of the organization that's represented in the mission of the organization. So it may be homeless women, it may be women with specific kinds of healthcare needs. It may be children who need early childhood education. That's your primary beneficiary group. But there's also secondary beneficiary groups, but there's also this thing called public good, which really gets to issues of our care about the sustainability and health of our communities overall. And so that's where it's things like equity, justice, environmental concerns, all of that is embedded in there. And I say that because that affects the way that that affects the way we look at issues like investment of our assets, et cetera, et cetera. So we're supposed to be pouring our resources back into, first of all, doing what's in our mission very specifically, but secondly, into creating public good overall. That, so we should not violate clean air provisions. We shouldn't violate the provisions that like healthcare provisions. We're like government in that we are like for-profits in that we are both private corporations. So with that, I'm going to turn this over a little bit to Douglas Rushkoff, who is the professor of media and digital economics at the City University of New York. Douglas has very clear views on what makes nonprofits a better bet for the future of business in this country than for-profits. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to a video from Doug.
Business people, why do they hate this model, this bootstrapping model, this nonprofit model so much? Well, because their goal is to build a business as the product, right? So the thing that you're doing is not the product. The company is the product. And then you can sell the company for 10x or 100x or 1000x all at once. They love that too, because when you sell your business, the money you get is called capital gains, and capital gains are taxed really low. When you're making money from your business, what you're doing is usually taking dividends or taking payroll. Payroll is taxed really high. Well, why is that? Because God decided that? No. It's because the people in the for-profit business industry, people who are selling their businesses, decided to do that. People who are really going meta on business and moving into financialization. Those are the ones who want businesses to be for-profit business, because you're building the business to sell it for a profit. And the problem for me, the bigger problem with this narrative, is that it requires an exit, right? That's what they use the term exit strategy. You start a business knowing that you're going to get out later. So when you know you're going to leave the business later, it frees you up to do pretty much anything you want, to piss anybody off, to destroy a territory, to ruin a town. You can do whatever you want because you're going to externalize the harm to others and hopefully exit before they come after you, right? You take the carpet bag and get out of there. So the idea is almost to try to build a car that could go fast enough to escape from its own exhaust. But a nonprofit can run more like a family business. You're in it for the long term. So you can embed in the community. You can have, workers and owners and community members all as stakeholders and all working together rather than antagonizing each other, because they have the same basic interests. They want the town to work. You're living in the town with your employees. Your employees are living in the town with your customers. So you want the water supply to be clean. You want the economy to be working. You can live in the same town because the business is benefiting the community. And I know it sounds awful. What if a business is benefiting the community? That means it's not making enough money? That means it's giving to charity? No, it means it's doing something that serves people, and that's why they're paying you, right? It's really simple. The other problem with the for-profit model is it's necessarily extractive. The idea is you open a Walmart somewhere, you pull as much money as you can out of the town until the town fails, and then you move on. You put people on welfare, right? You come in, you sell things for lower than cost even for a while in order to put all the local businesses out of business. Then you're the sole supplier and the sole employer in the town. So you can hire everybody part-time, put them on welfare or on Social Security while they're working for you until everything's gone. Then you move on. It's more like it's like a vacuum cleaner where you take all the money, all the chips off the table, right? The problem with taking all the chips off the table is when all your other players are bankrupt, they can't give you any more money, right? It's not a very sustainable approach. You have to move on, find another territory and another territory. It's a kind of a scorched earth tactic that optimizes for growth and sale. You extract all the value from a territory, sell your company, and move on. A nonprofit, on the other hand, it's optimizing for what we would call sustainable revenue or the circulation of value. It makes sense for a nonprofit to try to get everybody in the town as wealthy as possible so they have more money to keep spending. You want wealthy customers, not poor customers, right? So you try to make your customers, your suppliers, your community as wealthy as possible in the process. So instead of earning $10 one time, you take $1 and earn it 10 times as it passes through the community. You get the same $10 of revenue, but it's revenue, not something you take and keep and leave. So the real choice is really not between profit and prosperity. It's between whether you want long-term prosperity or short-term profit. Short-term profit in a for-profit company, it happens once, it makes enemies, and it destroys the world. Prosperity in a non-profit environment, well, that lasts forever, makes friends, and promotes a sustainable future. It's your choice. You can get rich either way. Thanks a lot.
So I'm thanking Douglas for that. I want to say, Douglas, you might be sitting there and thinking, well, this is a out on the limb point of view, but Douglas was named one of the 6 most influential thinkers in the world at one point by MIT. He is moving more and more into the mainstream in terms of the types of thinking that's going on about sustainable business. He very often gets rejected by corporate, the corporate world, but then he gets invited back. So there's something here in terms of a set of principles that the world is moving towards that we should definitely be proud of. This is where we have been for years. And so these are our financial principles that really guide some of the various regulations that we attend to. For instance, ensuring that nobody's taking too much in salary, or subsidies for sitting on boards, those kinds of things, so that we're not self-dealing. We're not creating situations in which there's self-dealing going on. Nobody should be unduly enriched by nonprofit work, but we all should be enriched by nonprofit work. That's a balance that we all have to attend to in all of our financial leadership work. So I'm going to move on here to a quick quiz for you. And this is a quiz that comes from Clara Miller, who wrote an article years ago called "The Looking Glass World of Nonprofit Finance." And I want you to just answer true or false to each one of these assumptions. So think about how this assumption applies to your work in a nonprofit, and answer true or false.
How are we doing, Elizabeth?
Good. We're at about think people are still coming in. We're at about 65%. So we'll give it another second. We are very well mixed in our answers. Okay, it looks like we're slowing down. I'm gonna share the results.
Okay, so the consumer generally buys the product or service. Now, if you were to look at for-profits, almost all of these answers would be true. It's only sometimes true in nonprofits. If you're in particular business models, it's true. In many business models, who's buying the service is actually a third party. And this is called, just really quickly, it's called the muted market. And we have an article that you can consult about this in the resource section that's called In But Not Of the Market. And it presents certain complexities to people who are working in nonprofit business models. So if what you're supposed to be doing is benefiting not the foundation, not the government who may be funding you, but in fact the people who you're set up to serve, which may be those homeless women or those children looking for early childhood education, you should be attempting to market as much as possible to their needs. But sometimes we get in a situation where we're weighing who we're trying to please in a primary way. And that's something that a lot of us feel when we're talking to foundations. They want one thing, the community wants another. They don't have the same interests necessarily at all. These are things that we constantly are negotiating as nonprofit leaders. The second one is prices set to cover cost and can be used to cover operational and capital needs of the whole organization. And bless you, if you, in fact, this is true for you. For a lot of nonprofits, it is not true that there's a lot of restricted money in nonprofits, and you're not allowed basically to use it to do things other than the direct service that you're set up to do. This causes a lot of organizations who have too much restricted money in their budgets to really suffer in terms of being able to innovate or set up reserves or other kinds of things that require excess to what it costs to deliver the service. For a lot of organizations that deliver contracted services, their money is just for those contracted services, and maybe not even that. There's an expectation in a lot of contracts that you're making up some of the difference. That causes you to have to go out and sell the work that you do 3 or 4 or 5 times rather than once. And so it just adds extra complexity to the work of nonprofit managers and leaders. The third is cash liquid in your organization? And this again has to do with, can you elect where you want to put the cash that you have on hand? And for a lot of organizations, again, because of the restricted money, you cannot elect where you want your cash to go. And if you come up against a lot of organizations were able to, during the pandemic, renegotiate contracts with their funders, but they had to renegotiate them. The money was set to go one place, they suddenly found the need to have it go another. And And so they had to renegotiate with their funders to allow that to happen. In other cases, people aren't paid for their contracts until much later than when they actually do the work. And in those cases, you may experience regular kinds of cash flow problems. So let's close out of that, and then let's go to again the article the muted market in but not of the market. That's in our resource section, and then Looking Glass World of Nonprofit money is also in our resource section. So feel free to go and check those out. So this actually is what really creates complexity in our work. And I have to confess that I didn't realize how much complexity it creates until I did a particular research project a few years ago. So where most of the time when for-profits talk about capital, what they're talking about is financial capital, economic capital, money, cash money. But is that the kind of capital that nonprofits really build on? Is that kind of the beginning and the end of it? And what I did a project in 2021, asking people what did they do when they realized that the pandemic was on them and that they had to very quickly pivot and make some changes. And I was surprised that they did not talk about financial capital as a first thought. They talked about social capital as a first thought. Then I went looking for, and that means all of their networks. It means kind of, how they interacted with their communities, basically. And so I went looking for some material that would give a sense of, is that, because I did case studies of 7 organizations, and I went looking for research that backed that up. And what I found is that there is, in fact, a bunch of research that says that the capital that we use as nonprofits is much more complicated. And in some ways, it's beautiful the way that it works. So I'm just going to quickly say the accumulation of cultural capital is capital that is embedded in our organizations. It's what we know. It's the people that we have on hand. It's how we function in the world around the issues that we have. So it's our embedded capital. Social capital, accumulation of social capital is the accumulation of networks that we are functioning in common cause with, and individuals that we are functioning in common cause with. All of that actually builds our economic capital. Those are the things that convince people to fund us. Because we're proving that we're kind of functional in the world that we're in. And then the accumulation of symbolic capital kind of combines all 3 of those, in that it is, symbolic capital is your standing in the world. It's how you prove to yourself that, how do you prove to the world that you have the influence and the standing to be able to get done this impossible thing that you're trying to get done. So when you put all of this together, it creates social value, but you have to actually have it all working at the same time. It's not just, the creation of economic capital. That's not how we work. We work very much through and with other people, and very much through our symbolic influence. So we create social capital, capture that, really make that very clear to other people, and then it naturally grows our influence and our impact in our organizations. That's the way nonprofits work. It's not as easy as looking for financial capital to create a product that's going to sell. It's something very different from that. So this is the purpose of a system, if it's functioning well, is to create the impact that it wants to create, to exist inside of a larger system in the way that it wants to. And so because the end result we're looking for is social value, that is a much more complicated proposition than merely selling a product in most cases. So with that said, this is also, we have something in the resource section on this, and it's got an impossible title. It's the first item under the nerd section. But it's one of the best things I've ever read about the way nonprofits really work and accumulate financial and other types of capital. All of these types of capital are convertible into other types of capital. That's the one thing that's really important to recognize. And they, when we looked at the way nonprofits did that during the pandemic, it was stark, amazing. One of the most beautiful kind of orchestrations I've ever seen. It's the article by Gail Cordelez Renard in the resource section. Okay, and I'm going to hand this over. That's a very quick overview of how nonprofits are different from for-profits. And now I'm going to hand it over to Hilda, who's going to get down to brass tacks about the specific business models we want to talk to you about.
Thank you, Ruth. And so with that introduction, we are now going to move into that financial capital and the many ways in which nonprofits raise funds, earn funds, depending on their business model, and depending on the sources of revenue that they are able to attract. And so with that in mind, want to introduce you to these five, and some might say that there are more. From our perspective, we've identified five primary revenue sources that dictate the business model. First is individual, second is foundation, and often referred to as institutional. And each of these, I will be going a bit deeper into considerations, things to think about. So we have individuals, foundations, government. And again, I encourage you to be thinking about who are your primary partners as you think about your business model. Fee for service, that concept where we're selling services to a particular customer, and membership. So using these five as the framework for the primary sources of revenue in the nonprofit sector, we want to start with individual. So with individual donors, who are they? They could be small to mid-sized donors. We know that organizations hope to have high net worth individuals in their list of donors. So it could be that either large quantities of small individual donations, high net worth individuals with maybe more significant donations, event participants, so we can have activities, whether they be special events of a fundraising nature or any activity that brings individuals to the organization. And then an ever-growing concept is this idea of donor-advised funds. So individuals make a contribution to an entity, that typically community foundations, that hold those dollars and then go ahead and designate those funds to a particular recipient. So as you're thinking about individual donors as a major source of revenue, there are a lot of things to think about with regard to who is the donor and what are those relationships with the donor. In terms of examples, Ruth, any perspectives on these examples we've shared here?
Well, I mean, there's any number of examples of individual donor organizations. And I guess one of the things that one of the organizations that I really like to give as an example is Susan G. Komen for the Cure, who was completely dependent on their individual donor base, not entirely dependent, but largely dependent on it, and kind of risked it all with taking a position that a good portion of the donor base did not agree with. They have never recovered from that. So it's, in their case, they, through events, created participants in the organizations, regular donors in the organizations. Once they kind of took off in a direction that the donors didn't agree with, a lot of the organizations that ran those events also took off. And so, yeah, it was kind of the ruination of them.
So thanks for that example, Ruth. I think in most cases, it is about that understanding the donor's perspective and what priorities are, and balancing those with what we have internally as organizations. Individuals, one probably the largest source of funding in many ways, other than government. Come back to that. So foundations. Who are the foundations? Who are the institutional donors? And in this case, foundations come in two types. They could be public foundations that raise funds and from the community and then make those grants to individual nonprofits. Could be private foundations, family foundations, or more institutionalized, larger professional foundations that they have their perspective. They have, as Ruth said earlier, they have what their mission is and how their nonprofit partners are really aiming to deliver on that mission. Foundations or institutionals could also mean regranting organizations like the United Way or donor collaborative. So sometimes there's this in-between entity that also has its frameworks and its institutional priorities that as an organization, making sure that we are responsive, we would need to understand. And then of course we have corporations that have their, sometimes out of corporate social responsibility, sometimes out of their marketing activities, they are funding nonprofits to support what they in fact are wishing to invest in. And in terms of the examples here, again, these are examples of nonprofits that are funded by foundations or institutional organizations that attract the foundation space. Anything you'd add, Ruth, to these, either one or both of these?
No, I think we'll talk about it later in the risks, but this is where bulk, where an array of institutional funders really matters. It's very dangerous to depend on a foundation because it can tend to, they are fickle beings. And even United Ways are fickle beings, corporations are fickle beings, and you have to be able to cover yourself. So it is one of those situations in which, unless you've got something on the other institution, you better not put all of your dependence on them.
They are, they do have certain indicated sort of benefits that we'll come back to, and as Ruth said, some of the risks there. And now we get to government, and government is often associated with scale. So philanthropy might fund some innovative programming, get ideas off the ground, and then we have government. And government is, there's lots of pluses and minuses. It comes in 3 different forms. And we could do business directly with the federal government. That is actually, from the work that we do with our nonprofit leaders, working directly with the federal government is probably the most flexible way to do business with government. Not flexible in terms of restrictions. It is a highly restricted source of revenue, but doing business straight with the source has a certain access to capital, for example, that increasingly becomes more difficult with the concept of pass-throughs. So when we think of government, we can do business directly with the federal government. We might do business with the state dollars, or we may be doing business with the state, but really as a pass-through of federal dollars. Same with local. We might have city dollars from the city council or the city budget, or we may have pass-through dollars. And so as you're thinking of who is your primary partner, secondary partner, who would I want to do business with in the future, government is comes in different flavors. And you would want to be sure that you understand what is the source of revenue for that government entity or for those government dollars. And with each layer, we see this tremendously now with ARPA and the up and coming infrastructure bill. With each layer where the federal government grants money to the state that then grants money to local or directly to the nonprofits, there's another layer of what we will call bureaucracy, process and controls. So different stakeholders under the concept of government, often thought as the scale element. If we have an established human service program that has been tested and trued, and we can show outcomes and we can present those outcomes to government, it may be the source that brings us to a scale. When you compare the size of government coverage in the sector versus private, government by far has the largest area of coverage, particularly in human services. Community action agencies working directly with the government for most of those services in the community. And then the next one is fee for service. And Ruth's quiz on, are we selling services to an individual customer or is it a third party? This is the area really where the customer is paying for the services. And so the customer is expecting a certain level of experience with goods being purchased or services. And you can imagine the experience at the New York City Ballet or at a school that has particular fees for enrollment. Those are that direct customer relationship between the nonprofit and the customers themselves. So they're buying experiences, and there's that sort of direct connection with that particular entity or with that particular customer. And lastly, we have membership. And on the membership side, it's really about individuals who share a common cause. So this membership organizations typically are membership organizations by design, whereas a nonprofit that has these other sources may have membership, but that tends to be more sort of activities driven. If you're a membership organization, you are by design a membership organization. And in this case, you have a common cause, a common identity, a common purpose. And we have three examples here that, two examples and just more generally industry and trade, where we realize that some of you may have responded to being a membership organization, and that was noted earlier. And in terms of evolving into a membership organization, these are some examples that we can think of. Would you add anything to that, Ruth, in terms of membership?
No, I think it's membership organizations are their own special being, and they have a very different cultural dynamic than many other kinds of organizations. And because their donors also tend to be involved in some form of governance over the organization. So it is a significant difference because it's modeled into that form of organization.
And so I've been asking you along the way to think about what is your primary source of revenue, and would love to have you participate now and let us know. We realize that most organizations have a combination of sources, but if you had to mention your very primary revenue source, what would it be? The number one source of revenue for your business model today. Elizabeth is keeping an eye on those responses.
While we're doing that, I want to say there's a question in here. I'm just going to answer this quickly. Yes, churches definitely fall under the definition of membership organizations. Many churches do, religious organizations do. So a good call, Lisa, on that one. Museums sometimes, but very often they have a mix. So they may or may not be primarily membership driven. Very often you'll see on the boards of museums large donors rather than individual members at a smaller level.
And so here's who's with us today. The largest percentage is with institutional funders, whether it be foundations, corporations, and then our second is government. And so between those two, pretty close to half. And then we have individual and fee for service, almost equal. And we do have a few organizations that have membership. Again, thank you for sharing that. With that, with that in mind, I will also cover some implications of what it means to have these as primary. And now, second question, what is your secondary? So we were primarily institutionals and government. Those were the top two, and then fee and individual. What is your secondary source of revenue? And as you're thinking about that, I will be moving into and want you to start to think about what are the unique aspects of each of these business models? What are the things we need to think about? And when you switch from your primary source to your secondary source, what went through your mind in terms of those relationships and how different they are? And so secondary revenue source, again, institutional funders. So definitely we have a group that is heavily influenced by institutional funders, either primarily or secondarily. And then second, we have individual donors as second sources, and then almost equally government and fee for service. So as we're looking to support you all in your evolution, one of the key things to think about is, how do I strengthen my primary source? A lot has been written about large growth. Significant scaling tends to come with one primary partner. Whereas there's also conversation about how should I diversify? Should I diversify? I'm often asked, is there a perfect balance of percentages that I should have across all these sources? And there really isn't a magic formula. I think the key is to understand that as we aim to diversify, we may need to build skills that we don't have in the current moment for us. So for those of you who had primary institution, if secondary was government, you've been working on those skills. Let's say that now the board wishes to see further diversification and you're going into individual donors. Each of these really has a certain set of sort of frameworks, considerations that we would want you to think about. When we hear revenue diversification as a goal, and we hear it often, the next question that I want you to ask yourself is, if we intend to diversify, have we made note of the considerations that we need in order to be successful with this new partner? And so these considerations are going to be organized into 4 different categories. Who is paying? So what considerations should we have about who is that source of revenue? What are the risks, sensitivities, things to be aware of as we enter that relationship with this additional partner? What is the leadership capacity? As leaders, are we prepared to do business with this new partner? And what would it take for us to be? What are those capacities of successful leaders that are successful with these sources of revenue? And lastly, what are the infrastructure needs? In our initial comments, we mentioned a few of these 5 sources that have significant requirements in order to be successful. So how do we build those before we start to do business with them? And notice I'm using the word doing business with, because that's what a business model is. The revenue driver is the driver of how you generate the funding for your mission. So it is about doing business with these partners that we have chosen or have chosen us. Keeping in mind this source of frameworks, let me start with this first one, which is this idea of sensitivities, risks, and challenges. What, in fact, are those? With individual donors, we know that there are many factors outside of our control. There may be macroeconomic conditions totally beyond any of our leaders' controls. There could be reputation risk, both for the individual and for the donor. And Ruth's example earlier of the one organization who maybe took a position that really worked against them in the long run. And so individual donors are really, think of them as representing the vast sector And you start to get into more sort of individual choices, maybe when you get into a major donor. And there is a reason out there why the IRS has a public support test, because as a nonprofit, we need to retain our own independence and not be subject to one individual donor's wishes. We never want to be an individual donor sort of pet project. Foundations. Again, outside of our control. You'll notice a theme here. A lot of these risks are outside of our control. So knowing that they exist, watching for the signs that they may be coming becomes key. Not that we can control or change, but being aware. So in the case of foundations, these institutional donors, there's a shift in priority. When we have conversations with leaders, it often sounds something like the foundation is starting a strategic planning process. And then there's a bit of a fear moment, because at the end of that strategic planning process, will we still be a priority? Will we be among the areas that the foundation invests in? And the foundation relationships are very people-centric. We have relationships with our program officers. Our program officers are with foundations for a period of time, and then professionally they move on. And so those relationships with the actual foundation, it's really the relationship with the program officer. We also know that from a place of historical access, it's about access to those relationships. And so if you haven't had that history of working in the foundation space, starting to build those relationships is that first key. Again, over relying on a single foundation or a single grant could be a difficult challenge. There's also the multi-year grants and what we sadly call the funding cliffs. So if an organization has been funded for a 3-year grant, wonderful that we have some reliance for that 3 years, but then what happens at the end of the 3 years? So the foundation risks are largely depending on how long we're being funded and what we're funding for and how those priorities might change. On the government side, again, in each one of these, outside our control, we see with each federal administration, priorities may be different. And so how can we successfully do work with the government when in fact it may be sort of an ever-changing priority for them and their match to us? Government, as I mentioned earlier, and those of you who are working in government, you know it's highly restricted, highly bureaucratic process, and I'll say more just about the capacities a little bit later. On the fee-for-service, it's really around the market. We may be competing with for-profit entities. We may be competing for individuals' discretionary spending, or we may in fact be providing a critical service. So what is happening in the marketplace and how my supply chain and other outside forces affect us? And then on the membership side, it's really about the unity of the members. We might have risks with economic downturns where people choose not to maintain that membership. There was a point made about churches. In some ways, you may have, some organizations may have a captive membership, but even in that sense, there may be some financial pressures to be thoughtful of. So knowing that these risks exist, you're going into these relationships and asking yourself, how can I prepare for these risks that I know are sure to exist? Ruth, any words of wisdom here?
No, I think, each one of these risk propositions are so very different, and they're complicated. So for instance, government money, you could see that as being fairly secure. But one of the case studies we did was with a multi-service center in, I think it was Illinois. And what had happened to them was that they had a big resettlement program. And this gets to some of the questions that people have been asking in the question section. Basically, when Trump was president, he shut down the flow of refugees and immigrants into the country. And so those programs were shut down at the same time. And in order to maintain those programs, they basically had to find a way to manage the infrastructure of them even while they had it kind of on mothballs. So it is a very political proposition in some cases. Anybody who's done local government funding knows that with a change in administration may come a change in local government priorities in terms of what they fund. The same happens at the state level. So managing all those different levels, it's complex. And again, it gets back to this the sense that this work is much more complex than for-profit management in a lot of cases. I don't want to beat that to death, but there are in fact these multiple aspects to it that you have to be working on all at the same time.
And that's a great segue to the leadership capacity. So as an organization, if I am going to attract individual donors, we really need to be visible, prestigious in some cases, in some other cases maybe more effective in terms of how we prove the outcomes in the communities that we work. On the foundation side, if we are going to establish new relationships with new partners, we want to be thinking how can we be innovative in the work that we do? How can we have a strategy that basically persuades that partner that our work is worth investing in? And a word that I choose to use as opposed to contributions is this word of investment. When you are thinking about foundations, high net worth individuals, they are making investments in the organization. They are not necessarily funding ongoing operations, as opposed to investing. We want them to be thinking not as a purchaser of services, but as an actual investor in the organization. And so understanding the current and the future landscape for the foundation world, understanding who's out there that wishes to invest in your mission becomes really critical. With government, I've learned through the years and have heard from leaders who have been successful that you really have to be thinking about way ahead what government is interested in investing in. What are those sort of instincts that as to what will be a priority in the future? We know lobbying and advocacy exists out there, but we're really trying to mobilize and be able to align with those government expectations. On the fee-for-service side, as I mentioned earlier, key to have an understanding of the market, to create programs that are responsive, to understand the trends in the sector with regard to services that people would be willing to purchase. And then on the membership side, again, if we are going to be responsive to our members, we need to have that concept of sort of embracing, be transparent about what we have to offer, think of what will engage our members, and continue that unity of purpose. If that unity is at risk, then the whole model becomes at risk because it is highly dependent on that membership engagement. So as you're thinking about these capacities, I just want you to think about where you are really strong now. And if you were going to diversify into another area here, what might that look like as you think of the capacities that you would want to build? Any words of advice, Ruth?
No, I think that these are pretty classic in terms of the central model. It all fits together in terms of the leadership and the, kind of the infrastructure that you need, et cetera, et cetera. They're all set up to serve the model in a way. So understanding the degree to which you can get your model done without compromising any of your ethical or legal responsibilities is just part of the job here. some people really, I want to just talk about one thing, which is this idea of, needing to serve the model. In the membership organizations, I was telling Hilda the other day, for instance, that Al-Anon and Alcoholics Anonymous have a 12-step, 12 traditions model. And in the model is the open reading of the ground rules for the membership. And for the funding of the organization at every single meeting. That's a way to just embed something so it's absolutely remembered by everybody in the organization, and that people have to talk about if they're going to violate it. Why would they even think about it? So those kinds of methods of managing your, making completely transparent and managing your model are very useful. If you can remind people, look, our work depends on this, and we have to emphasize this over certain other things and then balance it with that. All of that is part of the leadership responsibility.
And with that in mind, the last portion of this sort of what do we need to build are the infrastructure needs. And a lot of our work is supporting nonprofits to build the infrastructure they need for each of their models. So we see this in action on a daily basis. If we are driven by an individual donor base, if we would like to grow the individual donor base, we need to have the management systems to be able to capture the profiles, their giving capacity. We need to understand who are the potential donors. And so investing in fundraising databases and fundraising prospecting and research, definitely a muscle that you will need to build. With foundations, if we are going to be hopefully on a multi-year grant with a foundation, we need to have in the accounting world called systems for restricted funding. We know that some foundations give unrestricted, which is one of the beauty elements of individual donors. They tend to give unrestricted dollars. We know foundation funding is mostly restricted, mostly project-based. And so having the ability to demonstrate to our funders that we have in fact deployed those dollars in the way that they intended them to be deployed, those systems become really critical in the satisfaction of those restrictions, and having leaders being able to work around those systems. Where we see some pain points, there's usually a lack of this sort of full grant life cycle grants management. What systems would we need to build? We would need to build systems around grant reporting, and there would need to be a strong partnership between the finance and the development teams, more so in foundations than in individuals. There's the identification of who is this potential funder, and being able to understand the market and understand how we go and we find these particular sources, and then building those relationships. On the government side, it is absolutely a culture of compliance. I find that in this space, it is, in all spaces, it is critical, but in government especially, very critical that there be this strong partnership between program and finance around the concept of compliance. Program is very driven to comply with the requirements of this funding source. Very strong partnership needed there. Databases for tracking the participation of clients, for example. This point here, working capital, if I could put asterisks or neon lights next to this, I would. Government funding, for the most part, with the exception of federal, as I mentioned, is a cost reimbursement system. So if we are going to do business with the government, we need to have the working capital to upfront those expenses until government reimburses us. And so point of diversification, if I am low on reserves and I have no access to a working capital credit line, then that's going to be a difficult area to sort of break into. Our working capital becomes one of the most critical decision points in doing business with government, whether it's from our own reserves or from financing from banks. On the fee-for-service side, we need to have business planning capacity. We're running a business where we're selling services to the marketplace, where we need to price. Not that pricing isn't critical in every other aspect, but we need to understand our pricing strategy and how we're going to bring these products to market. And on the membership side, for all the things we mentioned earlier, communications, collection mechanisms, meaning billing and collecting those dollars, and knowing that we have the infrastructure to keep these members engaged and interested. So taking a look at this is an area that, again, when your board says, we really think we need to focus on revenue diversification, your answer would be, we will consider that, we'll plan for it, and let's think about the investments that we need to make in infrastructure in order to fully be able to be successful with this particular source. So very much an area of investment here. And I would love to know, as you're thinking about it, what area are you thinking about diversifying into? And I'm going to come back to that question right now. So what revenue source are you thinking about diversifying? And maybe it's something you've been thinking about. Hopefully, I haven't discouraged you from opening up your thoughts to this new source. But what is that? Which source is it that you would be thinking about in the prior slide about where you may need to make investments? And one of the goals of the Financial Commons is to support you all. So as you're responding here, it will give us an idea as to where are the areas where people are sort of breaking into, maybe thinking for if not the first time, really thinking seriously about this funding source. And given everything we've said, how can we at the Commons support you in that with additional tools and resources? Okay, so we see significant interest in building the capacity with individual donors. And second to that, fee for service. Again, remember that most of you said you were institution and government. So of course, this would be the flip side if you were diversifying. But we also see some institutional funder diversification, and then government seems to be the last here. We know that there is significant inflow of funds at the federal level from ARPA, and we've seen organizations trying to apply for those funds for the first time. And I would, again, just say, if you're thinking about applying for whether it's ARPA or any other source of funding, let's do that homework to make sure that we are prepared when it comes to those skills. So thank you. Thank you for sharing with us what your plans are here. And now, I mentioned at the beginning that we have sort of an unveiling of a resource that's been developed by the Commons that is now available for you on the site. And it is really a summary of what we've covered today. And in future months, each of these particular sources, there will be additional links to additional articles that will go much more deeply into each one, with more details about each of these 5 models and all of those considerations that we covered. So as you're thinking about each one, you can be on the lookout for these webinars that will follow. Each of the webinars will go a bit deeper into each of the elements of success, elements of risk, considerations for investment, and we will have at each of these webinars leaders who have successfully made that investment and have been able to garner the support from each of these particular. Now, if you're in the audience and you've been really successful with any of these, we want to know. We'd like you to be a part of that and part of the conversation in where you share with each other how you've been successful gaining the source of revenue that we may be referring to. And so now we would love to open up for some of those questions that you have been entering in the Q&A. I know Ruth has been keeping an eye on that. And Ruth, I'm going to turn it to you, and happy to be a part of answering the questions that you've been seeing.
Okay, and I would like to urge people to continue to ask more questions. We are accumulating these questions not just for answering now, but answering in these future 5 webinars. And to answer the last question we got, there is no cost for all of this. We are not charging for this. We feel like it's a critically important piece of infrastructure for the nonprofit sector in general to understand what the implications of each business model are. It's certainly something that's been available to the for-profit sector for some time, updated constantly, and we need to be in the same position here. So that's what we're here to do. Again, I do want to say, as I'm going into the questions and answers, that this project is going to be built around your wisdom and knowledge. And so whatever it is that's important to you, and whatever your experience has been with these business models, the more you participate, the better the final product is going to be on this. So we very much appreciate both your questions and your answers. And we hope that you'll bring that same questioning and, kind of learning and teaching stance to the forums, in which we will follow up on some of the questions that have been raised today. So that's also on the website. We have 3 moderators, Dana and Wade and Mark, who will be kind of moderating all of the discussions on there and helping us to learn as much as we can from each other. Okay, so there was a lot of questions, I think, about hybrid models, Hilda. So you did say something about the need for understanding the capital needs, that there is a run-up to actually creating a successful hybrid. And could you talk a little bit more about that? Maybe give an example of some of the development of a hybrid or two that you've watched.
Absolutely. And so hybrid is oftentimes referred to as braided funding, where you are thinking about your model and thinking, what are all the potential partners that might invest in our model, and how do I weave this together? And so we understand that, for example, let's talk about a hybrid model between philanthropic and government sources. Philanthropic tends to be sort of on the earlier stage of programming, willing to make investments in programs that maybe have not had the demonstrated outcomes. Government comes along, more willing to scale. We also know that government tends to be very restrictive in the dollars. And so philanthropy, even in project funding, tends to be a bit more flexible. A concept that I would want you to walk away with today is something that we've seen more and more this year, which is flexible program funding. So it's philanthropic funding for a particular program, but with the flexibility that leadership decides, where do I need to invest? Is it in salaries or is it in rent? And so for a hybrid model, you want to line these up in this sort of braiding effect where you're leveraging the two so that you have the scale of the government restricted funding with the flexibility of the foundation funding. The two together make for the whole. And so being able to have systems that tell you the information you need to know the total cost of the program, know how much one funder is covering so that you know how much the other funder is covering. Diversification is not only about the source, but also about the access and the flexibility of the use. So for example, we worked with an organization that was 35% foundation funded, 65% government funded. On the surface, you would think that is a sort of healthy, diverse portfolio. In fact, that 35% of funding was restricted foundation funding, and in those cases, highly restricted. So we had almost, the math is right, 95% restricted funding. That, of course, led to unfortunate end of the organization because they couldn't. That hybrid did not work. So in this, in the idea of bringing multiple sources, we have to think about how they complement. And one of the terms I like to think about is leverage. So how do we access one and access the other and bring it together to get the best of both worlds?
Mhm. I want to pick up on that. That was actually very useful, because you would think that on the surface that was a healthy mix of funding. But this question of how much restricted money is in your organization can trump every other question that you have. So the fact that don't actually track in a lot of cases how much of their funding is restricted funding, how much does the organization have to serve the basic capital needs of the organization, including any emergency needs, any innovation needs, et cetera, that's a real blind spot in the nonprofit sector. So it's something that I think the first thing that there were a number of questions here, and I'm going to ask you this in a minute, Hilda, about how do you track restricted money? What systems do you have to have in place for restricted money? What are your suggestions on how to approach that whole mess? One of the things that I would say first and foremost is to bring it up as an issue to your board and have some monitoring capacity to understand how much restricted and unrestricted money you have. This is particularly important if you have contracts that are paying less than cost on those contracts. That's a disaster. And some enormous agencies have gone completely under on that set of issues. So let me just hand it back over to you, just in terms of how, what are your suggestions on how to track and manage a lot of restricted funds?
And so I would say the first the first point here is to know what it costs to deliver the services, so that when we go ahead and enter into a contract with a funder that is not covering the full cost, we then know how much we've committed to raise. So something I didn't mention throughout the course, but I think I'd like to now, is this idea of indirect cost. So with unrestricted funding, no issue. We use it as we need to. With indirect costs that are built into government and that are built into foundation, if we know, and this is the key, we need to know what our indirect cost rate is. So if we know that our rate is 25% and we are accepting, because we applied for that grant, we worked really hard to get that grant from the foundation, and we're accepting 15% cap, which some foundations have, I am committing to raising the 10%. And that's part of that hybrid model. So where do I turn to for that 10%? I need to have unrestricted funding, be it from individual or earned revenue, the fee for service. And so the systems first start with what is the total cost of the service. So from the development perspective, if the development team had I'm thinking of a budget with columns, program A has a column of fully loaded costs. I, as the development director, can now go and raise money against this. When I have restricted dollars, I can line them up against the costs and know what else I have to raise. That requires, in terms of the question of systems, the systems are a combination of people. And so finance, program, and development need to be able to have timely and often meetings about what was the restriction. That's the development departments or the development program officers' communication with the funder. How are we delivering on those commitments? And that's the programmatic perspective. And how are we reporting on that? And so in the financial systems, if we have line item restrictions from a government entity or foundation, we need to have this multi-dimensional system to track it. And there, I don't want that to scare anyone away, because I often say even QuickBooks, meaning QuickBooks is sort of our entry-level software, QuickBooks can track everything that I'm saying, and so can every other software. Blackboard, our sponsor, Those are the mechanisms that the software is intending to track. But the software can't do it alone. We need to tell the software what the total costs are through good allocation methodologies. And then we need to track on a line item basis how that happens. If we don't have those systems and we don't track them, and we don't have the partnership between development and finance, we may charge the same dollar to two different sources, which would not be good at time of audit, or would not be good in terms of our transparency with our funders. So we need to have those mechanisms, not at the end of the year, but during the months as we're doing the accounting. And we want to check in on this on a quarterly basis so that there aren't any surprises when we realize that we took in a $100,000 grant to do these activities that we're unable to deliver on. Lots of communication and lots of partnership and strategy between the leaders.
Right. There's there's a number of questions in here about membership organizations and what are the risks involved in doing things like diverting from a membership only funded or majority membership funded model to a model that's that's funded largely from outside. And there are dangers to that. I want to go back to the Alcoholics Anonymous model and say that originally their idea was to be funded from outside. And a very wise funder, the Ford Foundation, in fact, basically, and this was, of course, 50 years ago, told the organization that they would essentially ruin themselves that way. That the best thing they could possibly do is to build something that really represented the members themselves, being a part of the governance of the organization. And so they reject all outside funding. They will not take it, which it's one of the few instances that I've ever seen of that. And then, on the flip side is all of the patient assistance organizations that essentially are being called up by the feds all the time for selling their advocacy agendas to pharmaceutical companies, saying that they're representing the patients, but actually representing the interests of pharmaceutical companies. So it's a representation issue and a who owns us issue in this situation that I think is really important. But is there anything that you'd want to say about that, Hilda?
I think the challenge I see with membership is that you mentioned governance earlier, Ruth. It's like a whole different design of an organization. So if you are a membership organization, I think the question is, how far do you stray from membership? And if you're not a membership organization, adding, quote, member benefits is something to really to sort of think about. And what does that mean to the model itself and the programming? So it's not as easy to move in and out as maybe in the first four.
There's a world of difference between naming somebody a member, like, a public radio station does, and actually treating somebody as a member, like some public radio stations do. And then you have a whole bunch of governance issues that you're asking for. And so you have to balance that. It's a very different kind of model. And we're going to talk much more about that in the future. There are so many other questions here. I want to go for one more, and then we're going to begin to close out today. But do remember that we're going to bring all of this stuff forward. So as we're beginning to close out, I would appreciate if there's anything else that you want to know significantly more about, please put it in the question and answer in that section so that we know what you need from us. Of course, afterwards, also, if you're involved in the forums, you can do the same thing.
And I'm going to come back to that. So please hold on to that thought.
Yeah. So I love this question because it does get to the issue of other types of capital. So the question is, what's the role of collaboration in building the business model that you're intent on creating?
collaboration with other nonprofits?
Mhm.
And so that's a great question, and one that gets to self-reflection. So what is your mission? And what are you really good at? And how is the funding available for that particular focus? Who else is in the community that is really good, maybe in a different service, and how the two come together? An example that when we think about program diversification, we often have leaders think about what are the programs that are key to me that I can raise funds for? What are we call those the heart programs. What are the programs that not only can I raise funds, but I can fully cover costs for? And then there are these programs that I may be passionate about, but I just am not able to raise funds for. So you take a youth development organization that sees a food insecurity moment for those participants and decides to start a food pantry. Well, they don't know how to raise funds for food. They don't understand the sources. They don't understand the sort of the common funders, but they know youth development. That's a real strength. And so partnering with, which is what this one example I'm thinking of did, partnering with a local food pantry that has the mechanisms of the donated foods and everything that it takes to successfully do that, the two together made for a strong partnership. So to me, collaboration comes from know what you're really strong in, know where you know that you can bring those revenues in, identify what are those other areas that you yourself cannot cover, and then identify those partners. Now, in that identification of partners, all about costs and who's going to, how is the information going to flow? Do you have the systems that really allows that collaboration becomes really critical.
Right. This whole issue of collaboration gets to the issue of network capital, basically. And that is convertible. The more buzz there is about how good your services are, how well a relationship has gone, the more attention your organization is going to justifiably get. If you screw up a collaboration, it will be known in town. If you do a really good job of that, that will be known in town. This is a situation in which you're constantly building kind of reputation, trust, all of those not so soft issues that we build our financial, our financial health on. We don't build our financial health on a good proposal. We build our financial health on the word of mouth of the people that we serve and our ability to get the attention of and influence the funders that we're hoping to involve. So I'm going to hand it back to you, Hilda, and we are going to leave the question and answer section open for a while for you to ask some of, this is what I want to learn more about later on, but also to give us some feedback on this session. What do you want more and less of, etc.
So to the resources, Ruth quoted specific articles earlier that are in this section of the Commons. It is being launched today. You have access to it. If you go and register, if you visit the Commons, you will see these articles are there. There's a special corner called the Nerd Corner. This is Ruth's creative sort of organizing of deep. If you're in the mood for that, there's some that are a bit lighter touch, but really articles that we curated to bring to you that address some of the topics that we mentioned today.
We're also asking in that section if you will bring your resources to that area. So we would love to know what you read, what really helped you, what tools you use, et cetera, and we're going to just build up that library over time.
And so this was the concept that Ruth was covering. It's actually, please don't put it in the Q&A, put it in the chat. Elizabeth is going to leave this chat open and give you a chance to continue to add to it. So what you put in the chat right now, in the next few minutes, will inform the program just the way Ruth has explained. And we want you to, if you're ready, just just keep typing. If you want to stay around and see what other people are indicating so that you have some things to look forward to, we're going to be here for just a few more minutes. Thank you. Thank you all for your engagement, for your questions, for choosing to spend this afternoon with us. And know that this is only one way to let us know. As Ruth mentioned, the comments are here for you. And so we're going to leave this open, and thank you all. Really appreciate you joining us today.
And don't forget to check in on the forums. Mark and Dana and Wade are there waiting for you. So I'm sure that you can get a good, strong conversation going about whatever it is that you want to learn.